So, a couple of days ago, Joe Rogan, a well known actor, comedian, famous UFC commentator, and podcaster, had Quentin Tarantino on his show, The Joe Rogan Experience. Everyone knows who Quentin Tarantino is. He is the director of many cinematic classics such as Reservoir Dogs, Pulp Fiction, Django Unchained, and of course, Kill Bill Volumes 1 and 2. Joe Rogan brought up Tarantino's recent film, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, a film set in 1969, spotlighting two particular individuals. Actor Rick Dalton, who is played by Leonardo DiCaprio, and stuntman Cliff Booth, played by Brad Pitt. Joe Rogan highlighted a controversial scene in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood concerning Bruce Lee, who is played by Mike Moe. Rogan mentioned that Tarantino's portrayal of Bruce was an asshole. Tarantino's response: I can understand his daughter having a problem with it. It's her fucking father. I get that, but with anybody else, go suck a dick. Very professional. The scene Rogan mentioned was a fight between the character Cliff Booth and Bruce Lee. And apparently, in this quote unquote fight scene, Cliff was besting Bruce. Before we get into it, Bruce's characteristics in this movie was of an arrogant know-it-all who claims that he can take Cassius Clay, later on Muhammad Ali, and had his hands registered as lethal weapons. To top it all off, Bruce Lee's infamous howl, the wah, was displayed as not an intimidating battle call, but a ridiculous sound of annoyance. Tarantino explains that Cliff's background was military, experienced in hand-to-hand combat, and has killed in the field of war. Tarantino insinuates that Bruce Lee was not a killer, and yes, would have defeated Cliff in a martial arts tournament, but not in the streets. Hence, Cliff throwing Bruce Lee into a car. If you have not seen Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, I suggest you do. It's all over YouTube, so take a look. In this scene, it is placed on a Hollywood, I say, set. And you have Bruce surrounded by, I guess, Hollywood stuntmen or actors or people in production. And apparently Cliff Booth was among them. So this is what Bruce talked about in this particular scene before they got into a fight. Bruce talks about truth in combat, specifically in boxing. He mentions Cassius Clay and Sonny Liston. He also talks about the comparison of boxing and being in a martial arts tournament. There's a fine line between combat in sports and combat on the streets. If you haven't heard any of my other episodes in the podcast, I usually talk about what's the difference between winning a fight and surviving a fight. Now, winning a fight, you are bounded by the rules and regulations. Well, it depends what type of combat sports rules that they display. Everybody knows that particular rules will allow you to be limited. Now, combat on the streets, which is survival, you're doing everything you can, meaning you're scratching, you're biting, you're using weapons that's available to you, finger jabbing to the eye, kicking to the groin, smashing the head on the concrete, all that street fighting stuff. What Bruce was talking about, two athletes trying to win and show who is the better person in combat. When we all know that Bruce always advocates about not participating in martial arts tournament because it was a game of tag, that in tournaments at Bruce's time, no hitting to the face, meaning you hit to the chest, everything stops, you win the fight. Very quick. We used to do this 1 point sparring, and obviously no hitting to the face, no hitting to the groin or to the leg. It's just the chest guard. So when we get into it, it was more of like, let me see if I could punch you in the chest before you get to me. It was like that. And then in the back of my mind, this is not real fighting. This is competition fighting, which was okay, but I wasn't into that. I was more into I need to learn how to fight just in case something happens to me on the street so I can survive and get out of there. But whatever I was learning in this school wasn't happening for me. Now, back to the scene, Bruce states, I do to win what they, Cassius Clay and Sonny Liston, do to win. I unleash all my power. And then he says, I kill people. When you watch the scene, you can feel this particular Bruce in this movie, his arrogance. Feels like he is a know-it-all, as I said before. And he's trying to impress the people or the production people around him just to make him feel that he is like the big star. And obviously, among the crowd or among the production team was Cliff Booth. And he's actually scoffing at what this Bruce in this movie was saying. Because someone in the production crew asked Bruce, what would you do if you went against Cassius Clay? And Bruce immediately said, I would crush him. That's when Cliff Booth starts to laugh at Bruce. Bruce notices, and Bruce asks Cliff, what's so funny? So Cliff kind of, backs away. He's like, I don't want any trouble. But then Cliff says, as Bruce keeps egging him on, it's disrespectful to Cassius Clay. And he tells Bruce that he's just a little man with a big mouth and a big chip. Then this Bruce Lee starts to get a little pissed off because he's not impressing Cliff Booth at all. So he challenges Cliff to not a fight, what people say, but a contest. 2 out of 3. Whoever can put who on their ass on the floor. So Cliff accepts. Bruce is dressed in his Kato outfit, the black limousine outfit, right? So he's taking off the jacket, but he leaves his gloves on, which was really odd. So the contest starts, and right away, Bruce runs and sidekicks Cliff in the chest, and Cliff falls. Cliff gets up. He says, very good, Kato. See if you could try that again. And for some odd particular reason, Bruce runs, tries to sidekick Cliff in the chest, but Cliff catches him and throws him against the car. So what confuses me about this contest is that the second time, Bruce did the same move, which allowed him to get thrown into the car. Knowing Bruce and reading about Bruce, Bruce won't do or wouldn't do the same move the second time. Even if Cliff said, why don't you try that again? I'm pretty sure Bruce, is smart enough to not do the same move the second time. But apparently this is Tarantino's movie, so apparently he did. And gets thrown to the car. So Bruce gets up. He's pissed. And then the quote unquote fight starts to happen, punching, defending, a little bit of trapping in there, a little bit of pivoting. And then it gets stopped by a character named Janet. Now, this scene was filmed because Tarantino heard about stuntmen hating on Bruce because he was apparently tagging them on the face or on the body. Apparently, Bruce felt that these stuntmen were not on his level of action. Now, just to let everybody know, when Bruce was tagging these stuntmen, it was during the time of the Green Hornet. This movie, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, was set in 1969. And the Green Hornet started from 1966 and ended in 1967. So I don't understand how Tarantino put Bruce into 1969 and still was doing the Green Hornet. This is a movie, so that's my analytical mind and historical thinking is coming into play. So don't mind me. So back to this stuntman hating on Bruce. Van Williams, the actor who plays the Green Hornet, confirms the hatred that these stuntmen had for Bruce. But I'm thinking hatred is a little harsh of a word. I would say maybe being upset or maybe being aggravated that they couldn't move as fast as Bruce. Apparently, Bruce wanted to be the stunt coordinator of the Green Hornet. And he went to Van and said that these stuntmen can't keep up with me, paraphrasing, of course. So Van talked to the stunt coordinator of the Green Hornet. And what I've heard is that this stunt coordinator had a tiff with Bruce because apparently he was agging his stuntmen. And Bruce's ideas of action and his idea of action within Hollywood was clashing. So Van talked to the stunt coordinator and he said, you know what? Okay, let's see if he can actually really do what he says he can do. So they gathered the Green Hornet production team and they actually filmed a scene where Bruce Lee coordinated all the fights. This short scene. So what Van Williams said in the interview that they filmed the scene in a low light setting. And apparently since Kato was dressed in black, you could hardly see him. So this short film was probably, I don't know, about 10, 15 seconds long, even more, but not so long. But then you can see him kicking people, and it's just like, it would have most likely been a better setting if the light was turned up, right? And apparently, when this short film was produced, they sent it to the executives of the Green Hornet. They saw the footage and apparently was laughing at Bruce's stunt coordinating scene. So Bruce got upset, went to the trailer. Van Williams said he was in there for hours. And then Bruce got out and went to Van and said, listen, I don't think I could do this. You and the stunt coordinator and you guys know what you're doing. So, I'm going to leave it all up to you. So I found an interesting quote from Matt Polly, who is the author of Bruce Lee Alive. When this scene came into light, the contest between Bruce and Cliff. In 2019, Matthew Polly stated that Bruce was very famous for being very considerate of the people below him on film sets, particularly the stuntmen. He would often buy meals, or once he got famous, take them out to eat or hand them a little extra cash or look after their careers. So in the scene, Bruce Lee is essentially calling out a stuntman and getting him fired because he's a big star. And that's just not who Bruce Lee was as a person. What I feel that this scene was a little exaggerated. And having Bruce Lee on this particular contest was not really necessary. But I guess in a movie, you would have to have some sort of historical person to boost up the level of audience to watch. Because as hardcore Bruce Lee fans, as myself and other people around the world, would look at this and be ashamed of how Bruce was portrayed in this movie. And also upset at how Tarantino directed this character of Bruce as an arrogant, as a know-it-all, which we all know that Bruce was indeed very arrogant, but not to the point where it's annoying, but it was a level of confidence. I believe that he did have beef with the stunt coordinators, and he did tag all these stuntmen because Bruce was that fast. However, using people just like, for instance, what I've read was a Gene LaBelle coming in to humble Bruce, and the story was that Gene LaBelle got Bruce on his back, and he was running around with Bruce on his back, and Bruce said, "Put me down, or I'm going to kill you." And Gene LaBelle says, "If I put you down, you're going to kill me." Apparently, that humble Bruce, which I really don't understand what that would have done to humble Bruce. Anyway, I mentioned before that when I did watch this movie with this particular scene, people were laughing, and especially the people who don't know who Bruce Lee is. Their first impression of Bruce would be this movie. All that battle, how that, wah, all that other stuff, people were laughing at that. They were thinking this guy is the greatest martial artist, but he looks like an asshole. And thanks to Tarantino for this portrayal of Bruce, didn't sit tight with a lot of people who read about Bruce, who's been inspired by Bruce. So, all that has been said and done, this movie altogether was okay, right? Obviously, it's not historically put together right because, like I said before, Bruce was doing Green Hornet from 1966 to 1967. And this was during the Manson murders. And obviously, at the end, people who were murdered stayed alive. So later on, after this podcast episode with Tarantino and Joe Rogan, and after the comment of Rogan saying, "Go suck a dick," Shannon actually responded, and which I thought was a pretty good response. I don't want to read into all of it, but I'm going to read a particular one I felt that was straight to the point. She said, "Look, I understand what Mr. Tarantino was trying to do. I really do. Cliff Booth is such a badass and a killer that he can beat the crap out of Bruce Lee. Character development, I get it. I just think he could have done it much better. But instead, the scene he created was just uninteresting teardown of Bruce Lee when it didn't need to be. It was white Hollywood treating Bruce as, well, white Hollywood treated him, as a dispensable stereotype. But that was Tarantino's creative device that he chose. So he initially claimed, though now he seems to be arguing, that this actually an accurate portrayal of Bruce Lee and is what would have happened if indeed Cliff Booth, a fictitious person, and the real Bruce Lee, if he were a mediocre, arrogant martial artist, had squared off. And she puts the wah in this statement. The fact that Mr. Tarantino espouses that my father could have been easily tricked by a fictitious character and would have really be a threat in a competition setting like Madison Square Garden speaks volumes about everything he does not know about Bruce Lee and JKD. But enough tit for tat. There's more. There's more. But from this part of what Shannon is talking about is actually true. You're putting a fictitious character against a real life person who is Bruce Lee. And this was I was saying previously. If Bruce Lee put Cliff Booth on his ass the first time, and Cliff said, "Why don't you try that again?" Bruce is smart enough not to do the same move twice. This is what the accuracy of what Shannon is talking about. Shannon continues in closing. At a time when Asian Americans are being physically attacked, told to go home because they are seen as not American and demonized for something that has nothing to do with him or with them. I feel moved to suggest that Mr. Tarantino's continued attacks, mischaracterizations, and misrepresentations of a trailblazing and innovative member of our Asian American community right now are not welcome. Now, if you're wondering, there is still anti-Asian attacks, I would say, around the United States and some areas in Europe. The highest that I've seen so far is in Canada, which was surprising. Shannon continues, Mr. Tarantino, you don't have to like Bruce Lee. I really don't care if you like him or not. You made your movie, and now clearly you're promoting a book. Of course he is. But in interest of respecting other cultures and experiences you may not understand, I would encourage you to take a pass on commenting further about Bruce Lee and reconsider the impact of your words in a world that doesn't need more conflict and fewer cultural heroes. Under the sky, under the heavens, we are one family, Mr. Tarantino, and I think it's time for both of us to walk on. Very classy. I feel Tarantino did not understand who Bruce was and felt that whatever he knew, he put that in the movie. He even said or cited that he read Linda's book, right, about Muhammad Ali. And then in an interview with Joe Rogan, he even cited Matthew Polly's book about the stuntman. Even if that's the case with Bruce and the stuntman, later on, going back to what Van Williams said about this small stunt coordinating scene, it would have been a pleasure to see this in full light, meaning I don't understand why they had to put this particular scene with a dark setting, but you can't really see the details. And I think because during that time, during that era, they didn't want Bruce to do anything. He didn't want to be the star of the show, which he actually was, but the star was Van Williams. Not saying Van Williams had anything to do with being some sort of discriminating to Bruce's skill as a martial artist on screen, but it would have been fair if you're going to give Bruce Lee a chance to film a scene from Bruce's ideas of stunt coordinating, keep it to the point where, like, if you're going to do some sort of production, put the lighting up. But then, of course, it's during the time of, let's not put any type of ethnicity on top of Hollywood. Now, in my opinion of this whole response from Shannon is this. Tarantino has no professionalism and has no respect to Bruce Lee fans. I mean, of course, it's his movie, and being explicit as he is, it catches people's attention. But if you're going to use Bruce Lee in a movie, be accurate. I mean, do your research. It seemed like he did no research whatsoever and put him into a particular scene where he's being bested by a fictitious character, and also having the majority of the people who were watching this movie laugh at Bruce. Now, don't get me wrong, Mike Moe, fantastic actor. His rendition of Bruce was to the T. His articulation of how Bruce talked, even his mannerisms, even the battle call, or even the battle cry, the wah, all that stuff like that. However, the direction that he was put in was not his fault. It was direction of the director. So let's not put any blame on Mike Moe's performance of Bruce, because it was down to the T. Now, if this was another type of scene and they put at least Bruce to the point where he should be respected as a person in a martial arts setting in a cinematic view, then it would have been okay. And then Mike Moe would have been, his performance would bring him higher. This film, not put him lower, but put him in the light where it wasn't accepted by Bruce Lee fans. I mean, listen, this is a movie. I get it. I understand that he's going against a fictitious character, but realistically, Bruce would have put Cliff on his ass twice. But if you're going to play around and put Bruce on his ass and make fun of his character, then don't put Bruce in there at all. But people are saying, oh, it's just a movie. What, Bruce, is human being. He can't be Superman. Of course. Right. But then Cliff besting Bruce in that third fight. Now they're going against each other like they were like evenly matched. Bruce is faster than that. Bruce is smarter than that. And just to bring up Cliff's experience in the war, that he killed people and that Bruce is not a killer. I mean, okay. So let's say if Bruce did fight Cliff in the streets, I'm not saying Bruce is a killer, but when he mentioned that he would cripple Muhammad Ali, Bruce would cripple Cliff Booth in the streets. I'm certain of that. And now people are saying, oh, he's just a fictitious character, Cliff Booth. I don't give a shit. You want to talk about this? This is what we're going to talk about, right? Seriously. Bruce was Kato, fighting fictitious people. So what's the difference if Bruce was fighting a fictitious character, Cliff Booth? What's the difference? Oh, because Cliff was in the military and he killed people. That doesn't make sense. Even my idea of this scene would have not make Bruce as arrogant, but make Bruce as confident that he can take on Cliff, and would humble Cliff instead of humbling Bruce. It would have been a much interesting scene other than making Bruce like an asshole. Right? So we've come to the last word of the podcast. And as you can see, I'm solo today, so haven't done this in a while. But my last word of this podcast, nothing related to Bruce. When I release this episode, it will be the time where it's already been a few days after it has been announced that Richard Donner, the director of Superman, The Goonies, Lethal Weapon, had passed away at the age of 91. The movie Goonies was a great part of my childhood, me and my brother. And obviously, bringing Superman into the cinematic area where he made us believe that a man can actually fly. So Richard Donner, rest in peace. And guys, I'll see you next time, all right?
That in the United States, I think something about the Oriental, the true Oriental should be shown.
Hollywood sure as heck hasn't.
You better believe it, man. It's always that pigtail and bouncing around, chop, with the eyes slant and all that. And I think that's very, very out of